want to add anything to that, Charlene?
Yes, basically speaking, my call as a non-historian has always been to get this kind of message out to people in general so that we begin to join that protest that we saw yesterday on the last video. Those of you who were not able to watch yesterday, I believe we're going to show you that video, a little more of that video. To become, I keep reiterating the point that we have to see ourselves as that larger movement of people in the Caribbean, largely working class people, who simply come out in what I called soft power and join arms in public protest, demanding human rights from the small few that control the world's resources.
Okay. Brian?
Yes. Well, I have a bias for international relations, and as such, my personal standpoint is that Haiti being a sister CARICOM country, Haiti being a member of the CARICOM community, it is important that we as Guyanese, a sister country, support our fellow Haitians in their solidarity movement. Like Dr. Hines said, the initial resistance movement began with coffee, began with the coffee struggle. The Haitians were able to take that to another step. They were able to fulfill that struggle. They were able to get justice, fight for justice. And if we cannot be in solidarity with a justice movement, what exactly are we having as a community, as a people, in our own country, as well as those in Haiti? So I think it's very important as a CARICOM sister country to support, to be in solidarity with our sister CARICOM country, Haiti. My initial statements.
Okay, and I think those are good statements to start on. We're going to go into a video. We're going to start a video 5 minutes in. This is a video we started to show already yesterday. So we can start it now 5 minutes in, not from the beginning. So we'll ask the operator to start the video around 5 minutes in. And it's a video that that portrays what is going on in Haiti now, and particularly it captures the movement after Aristide was ousted in 2004 and the people protested. So we'll ask the operator to go to that video, please.
Here will be a good people, but you have to understand when they come to make like some kind of operation, they said they're looking for like bandit, okay, but if you don't see the bandit you're looking for, but you shoot everywhere. It's not and when you come here, shoot on the people's house, kill brother, sister, and mother, father.
It's apparent and it's clear that right now they're seeking political cover for this again, that they're going to try to keep the lid on it as much as they can. But again, it's going to be up to us to get those images out, to get this video footage out of the victims and of the actual operation so that we can show people that indeed they had barred the Red Cross from entering the neighborhood, that indeed they were firing from helicopter gunships. But remember, with the way in which these massacres are similar to 2005 is that when the United Nations goes into this community, they don't bring medical units. They don't plan for the contingency that civilians will be killed. Why? Because they are not going in to injure people. The United Nations is going in to kill people, and as you said, this is collective punishment. It is retribution, basically, for their holding out and resisting what they call and what they consider a United Nations military occupation of their country.
Je ne dis encore, c'est la guerre préval ba nous. Nous disons que le président préval merci parce que c'est la guerre nouvelle Liban de Cité Soleil. Vinn craser peuple en de bras neuf, craser Cité Soleil. Comme il pas accepter comme nous même peuple Cité Soleil n'a toujours mobilisé. N'a toujours mobilisé, n'a pris la ria là, nous jouons à venir là pour nous demander préval comment la vie peut s'en avec
Everybody who's looked at the gun problem in Haiti has said that what's happening in Cité Soleil is only a symptom, that the guns get to Cité Soleil as at the end of a long chain, and that chain starts in the United States where those guns are allowed to be, sometimes illegally, but they're allowed to get onto ships, and the ships are sent to Haiti, and they're actually bought by organized crime syndicates that are based generally in Pétionville, in the wealthy neighborhoods. They don't live in Cité Soleil. And it's when those organized crime syndicates think it's to their advantage, they will let some guns go down to Cité Soleil. And the problem is that the UN is only targeting that, even though everybody, including the UN, whenever they've looked seriously at the issue of guns in Haiti, have said that the problem is really up in Pétionville and in Miami and in the port of Port-au-Prince, not in Cité Soleil. But the difference in Cité Soleil, unlike Pétionville, is the people in Cité Soleil are getting out in the streets, and they are demonstrating for the United Nations to leave because they do not feel that the UN peacekeepers right now are playing a constructive role in Haiti. They would rather see the UN leave and President Aristide come back. And that is the real problem.
I'm looking at the press release from the United Nations, and they say they're working with the security forces of Haiti. And in their press release that was released last Friday after the killings in Cité Soleil, they say the operations have resulted in the arrest of 24 kidnapped suspects and the liberation of 6 victims. A number of weapons were also seized. Final comment.
So, dernier tuerie qui fait dans Cité Soleil là, monde qui était mort yo.
Last killing that was done in Cité Soleil, the people who died.
C'est pas monde qui te gen zam nan men yo.
We're not people with guns in their hands.
Te gen femme enceinte, te gen ti moun nan yo.
There were pregnant women and children among them.
Gen selon sa journaliste et témoin qui étaient sur place rapporté, te gen entre 30
journalists,
et 40 moun qui mouri.
And according to journalists on the ground, there were between 30 and 40 people who died.
Et nous-mêmes nous pensons que gen 60 et 80 moun qui mouri.
But we think it's between 60 and 80 people.
Parce que même dans la population, les ap kouri, yo prend moun qui tombe yo pour yo aller avec yo.
Because the people, when they run, they take the people who fell to run with them.
The reason, in large part, that they can get away with this is because of the willingness, the complicity, the active support of major U.S. press organizations, including Associated Press.
Well, also, what about the human rights groups? Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, none of them have so much as called for a serious investigation into allegations made by the community of these massacres by the United Nations. Why is Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch helping to cover it up? If there's nothing there, then there should be absolutely nothing wrong with devoting resources to doing a real investigation and then tell us that the members of the community and the videotape that we have are lies.
I think the TV gone. Hi, and we're back. As you were just looking at the video, what is going on in Haiti. So we're now going to continue the conversation based on that. As you saw in the video, people were protesting in the streets, being shot at. People were dying in the streets, protesting against the atrocity. The atrocity being that a foreign government practically invaded Haiti, and in doing so, ousted a legitimate, democratically elected government, right? And that, I think, is in itself a statement about where we are in the Caribbean and what it means in terms of our own independence and our continuous fight for justice. Charlene, if I want to bring you in, immediately, what is your reaction to the video?
Well, if you look back at the whole business of Haiti having to pay France for reparations for having lost their property. We were the property of the European powers. In these times, we are still considered property because that world order, that way of thinking, that to use an academic word, that epistemology, that sense that the powerful nations, even though they're the smallest in number in the world, own the bodies and the resources of the people of the largest and the resources of the world and the largest populations. So the war has now taken on a different kind of psychological dimension. Previously, slavery was maintained under the gun and under the whip. Today, it is being maintained under the gun again, but under a deeper kind of psychological repression because we are no longer chained. We are no longer on a plantation out of which we cannot escape. But the plantation has now entered our minds. We've become mentally enslaved. So that is the place at which we are now as Caribbean people. As Brian was pointing out, we are also economically enslaved, which is another condition of the mind.
Yes, we've been so taught that the plantation has moved, but we have a new plantation, a neo-colonist, neo-colony.
Yes.
And as we remain at the production level, what I found striking in the entire video is that you saw an army against civilians.
Yes.
In any other part of the world, grave human rights problems. Because you didn't see the Haitian army there. You saw people in slippers, a woman dressed as a normal working class. These were normal people who were being essentially dealt with
Unarmed people.
by United Nations peacekeepers.
Yes.
Because it's a conflict zone.
Yes.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, but you're right.
One who is, you had a democratically elected government by the people removed because the government decided not to privatize industries, to maintain state control over basic industries, to ensure that your citizens are catered for. These are basic institutions.
And Dr. Hines, what is your take? How did we end up there with Haiti? We're talking here about the ousting of Aristide in 2004. How did we get there? How did Haiti get there? Yes. How did Haiti get there today?
And one of the things that we have to grapple with, I think, is the question of independence, not just for Haiti, but for the rest of us in the Caribbean and other parts of the so-called post-colonial world. That is, having won our independence, we are forced to defend that independence.
Thank you for that perspective, Dr. Hines, putting it both in a historical context but also the economic context. But what is clear there as well is a political dimension, a dimension of defending our independence, defending our democracies in the Caribbean region. Brian, I'm going to bring you in here. How do you see the significance of the assault on Haiti in 2004 and the ousting of a democratically elected government in light of democracy and continuing democracy in the Caribbean region?
It's an assault on democracy. It's an assault on justice. It's an assault on liberty. It's an assault on the very people of Haiti. Essentially, you're telling the people of Haiti, you do not trust your competence in electing a government. You do not believe that you know what's best for yourself. You understand your living conditions, or we don't believe that what you believe is true.
Charlene?
I want to keep us on the thread of understanding what it is to stop seeing ourselves as somebody else's property and start owning our bodies and owning our own minds and owning our own education process. There is one thing when we talk about negotiating with the stranger, negotiating with the outsider, but there's another thing to understand, that the people that are negotiating must be in full possession of themselves. And, you know, this makes us bring the whole question of identity up. Who do we see ourselves as? Just now, Brian and I were talking about when we were trying to get Dr. Hines on video there, that people who are mixed with African descent in Guyana do not call themselves African, they call themselves mixed. And in that sense, what happens there psychologically is they become disconnected from origins. So that even when they study, even if the school system were to provide the education, which I do not believe it is providing the education, where people can understand world events in light of their own learning to be self-reliant and learning to take possession of self and resources, even if that were true, if our identities are not established in connection with our origins, we are going to be more and more in trouble, and we are going to sustain the very systems that are destroying us. This is what's on my mind right now. I don't know if Dr. Hines wishes to respond.
Dr. Hines? Yes. How do you respond to that? And more so, what is the way forward for us?
The way forward?
Yes.
Well, one of the things that we have to do is to embrace Haiti. Those of us in the rest of the Caribbean. David Rudder, in one of his classic calypsos called Haiti, in the late 1980s, talked about rallying around Haiti, looking inside Haiti and restoring our glory. That Haiti today is the most populous country in CARICOM, almost 10 million people. Now that's very important, right? So the whole regional integration movement has to move beyond trade and to take into consideration the cultural groundings. And so we have to embrace Haiti, I think, as an equal partner and as a member of the family. We in the English-speaking Caribbean have been guilty of constructing Haiti in a cultural sense, in the image that was created for us by Europeans. In the sense, Haiti for us was the other. A lot of that had to do with language, a lot of it had to do with our own socialization as part of the British Empire. Now we've got to break that. I'm stressing culture here because a lot of times we talk about trade and economics and so on, which are important. But we have to understand that a lot of what Haiti represents is a kind of cultural freedom, a kind of cultural liberation, and a cultural connection with the rest of us. You know, if you go to Haiti, Haiti in some sense was able to preserve Africa in its
Charlene, culture.
Oh yes, I totally agree. Dr. Hines has said this. I've always endorsed it.
In fact, yesterday we had Mr. Braffett on the program, and he was talking about Haiti's significance and its practice of Odan, which is misunderstood, and its relationship to West Africa and its relationship to the land. You understand that this is the people who celebrated the land, and in that cultural sense, therefore, it becomes significant. Brian, do you want to chime in on that?
Well, as a matter of fact, interestingly enough, there is a trip planned to Haiti in the future, because the mass media or Western media portrays everything Haiti as bad. And if you do some research, you'll actually see that Haiti is actually a very beautiful place. And there is a trip in the future by some university students to Haiti.
That's wonderful.
That is trying to connect, because we see ourselves as the next generation. The problem is there, it has been allowed to fester. But it's time, high time, we start correcting. If we're going to continue with CARICOM, continue the integration movement, then we must be able to understand and appreciate our sister countries, sister islands.
There's some Haitian students at the university, right?
Yes, they are. Yes, and they're very vocal. In the last
vocal.
issue of the Dominican Republic and Haiti issue,
Yeah.
they were very vocal on that issue.
Okay.
They're present. I mean, the university shouldn't function, in my humblest opinion, without having exchange students from the Caribbean.
Okay.
It's important that we understand each other's issues if we're going to go forward with any integration idea.
Okay. Dr. Hines, Brian is just, basically, well, in complementing what you've said, he's also saying that at a fundamental level, young people have to take up some responsibility in terms of how we move this agenda of a culturally inclusive, a culturally connected Caribbean community that sees Haiti and Haiti's success as central to that community. How do young people play a role in that? How do you see it?
Well, I think the young people have to begin at the level that all of us begun, and that is the level of education. I think the young people have to demand an education that is indigenous to our experiences. We continue in Guyana and the Caribbean to educate our young people to understand others, to understand even our former oppressors, more than understanding ourselves.
Correct.
So I think we have to start at the
actually quite interesting, because at a previous discussion, it was noted that at the secondary level, even at Cape, at best you got a cursory look at Haiti, at best. And I'm still trying to grapple with Plato at university. And I'm thinking to myself, there were genuine struggles in the Caribbean region. And I'm sure my course at line doesn't have Toussaint Louverture, who would have struggled for equity, struggled for justice. And these are struggles that continue. They're always there. But we don't study genuine Caribbean local ideas of struggle. But we transcend, as you said, Mr. Hines, all the way to our former colonial masters. Maybe we're trying to emulate them? I'm not sure. But I think that we have genuine instances in the Caribbean to which we can identify with readily. And we need more education, as you rightly said, at every level, secondary, university, about our national leaders, our national struggles, and our sister Caribbean territory struggles, if we're going to push with integration.
Yeah. And Charlene?
Yes, I'm going to bring you back to my original point, that if we are to possess ourselves, if we are to own our own bodies, that engagement in the mass struggle is going to be crucial. Because to isolate ourselves and to think that education has to do with getting a better job or getting a certificate so you can get a better job, we would be in fact being miseducated again. I would like to see more of this kind of discussion we're having here, but when we leave the studio, the discussion should be translated into action. Otherwise, it becomes empty talk, dissipating into the air again. And I believe this is what Professor Hines is calling for.
Yeah.
A tangible, an education that is meaningful in transforming slaves into people, slaves and indentured servants into people.
Enslaved.
Yes, enslaved Africans and indentured East Indians into people, and the other minority groups who came in and became part of that discourse of oppression, seeing themselves through the eyes of the oppressor. The only way to change that is to re-engage, to recreate our institutions. And we cannot do that just reading and talking.
Yeah.
There must be work, there must be action.
Yes.
And fundamental change. In closing then, we'll start with you, Brian, and we'll end with David Hines. But in closing, what would you say is our biggest challenge? And I want you to speak from the perspective of a young person. What would you say is our biggest challenge today in terms of Haiti and the Caribbean community?
I would say, as a young people, because we don't have that concerted together, that concerted effort. We're not together. We're all essentially concerned with our own business. We have not coalesced. We haven't developed an identity together as young people, deciding this is what we want to build our nation on. This is what we want to have a future with. Because we haven't decided that, we're fractured.
Yes. Beautiful.
So we cannot thrust for justice, we can't thrust for equity, because we haven't figured out what we want. And we need, as young people, to come together and decide, this is what I want to see as a nation, and this is what I want to see as a member of CARICOM. Because we will inherit CARICOM.
Yes.
We're the ones who will inherit the integration movement. And if we cannot at this stage figure out where we want it to be, it will continue to perpetuate a seemingly quiet community,
the plantation,
a not activated community, and we'll continue to be subjects of the neo-colonialist ideals.
Charlene?
Yes, I endorse everything. I would like to hear Professor Hines. The plantation lives on, and the struggle lives on. It is really part of a global struggle.
Yes.
And this is what we have to recognize. But I remember Professor Hines once saying to me, we have to become global in Guyana first, which means that connectedness that Brian is talking about in a very real way. Guyanese students are too shy, too withdrawn, not vocal enough at all to begin, not even to vocalize what they're feeling, let alone to come out. And so this is what we have to build. And I'm hoping that the Haitian students among us will help to give us some of that courage. The young man who is teaching us Haitian Creole, Haitian language, is actually a survivor of the earthquake. Can you believe that? He's 23 years old. He saw his fellow students die in front of him. He's a survivor. In the full sense of the word, in the sense of him carrying the history of his country with him and becoming an educator in his own right in our country.
And I would say the history and spirit of his country, you know, bringing that resilience here. And we did talk a lot about the resilience yesterday of the African people, and that Haiti itself is a representation of that resilience. That resilience, you know, Mr. Braffett said yesterday that that the Amazon warriors that are so famous, that, you know, it's been made into Hollywood movies, you know, the story of the Amazon warriors, that the Amazon warriors, that story comes from West Africa, and therefore it's a story of resilience, a story of people who don't know about being tied down, in a sense, being in bondage, and they're always fighting against
yes.
that thing.
And disunited. A friend called me this morning to remind me that, again, look at it, the Walter Rodney, the inquiry that's going to soon come up, the Walter Rodney inquiry, may actually run the risk of dividing the African Guyanese community again. So we have to be careful that what seems to be our medicine, if it's not coming from us, deep down inside us, may actually be our poison. Dr. Hines?
Yeah. And of course, the Walter Rodney inquiry also has the potential to unite us.
Well, this is what, yes.
If there is need for that. I don't think
exactly.
that, I don't think that,
we want to make it
that
our,
there is
our
division.
medicine.
Yeah. So, in closing, and we're going to end with you, Dr. Hines, what do you see as the biggest challenge for us
I think it's our biggest challenge is the question of self-definition. As we look at 50 years of independence in the English-speaking Caribbean, I think we have moved from independence where we sought to define ourselves on our own terms, as the Haitians tried to do in 1804, to a point where we have dropped the ball in terms of self-definition. George Lamin, the Barbadian and Caribbean novelist and thinker, said that
Thank you very much, Dr. Heinz, and I think that is an excellent note and an excellent summary of what we've been saying and what we are saying today and what we'll continue to say tomorrow. Again, if you're joining us now, this has been Haiti Stands, a special presentation of our solidarity effort to the people of Haiti in these International Days of Solidarity with Haiti. You can join us again as the mini-series continues tomorrow, same time, 7:30 to 8:30 on this channel, HBTV Channel 9. Thank you for joining us, and do ensure that you make your statement in relation to Haiti. Thank you.